"Get that chalk out of your hand," Professor Harlan Whitfield said, his voice dropping to the particular register men like him reserved for children and servants. "Put it down, now." The young man at the blackboard didn't flinch. He didn't turn around right away. He stood there with the chalk still between his fingers and the last symbol of the equation still drying on the slate, and when he finally did turn, he looked at Professor Whitfield the way a man looks at a thing that does not yet understand what it is dealing with. "I was just finishing," he said. He wasn't a student, he wasn't supposed to be there. Everyone in that lecture hall knew it. 34 graduate students in the Department of Applied Mathematics at Alderton University sat in tiered rows and watched, and not one of them said a word. The young man in the gray custodial uniform, the one with the mop bucket still sitting outside the hall's propped door, had picked up a piece of chalk and written something on the board that none of them could follow. And Professor Harlan Whitfield, who had tenure, who had a named chair, who had published 4 textbooks bearing his portrait, had just told him to put it down. He had no idea who that young man's father was. He had no idea what that young man had written. In 47 minutes, he would find out both things at once, and his hands would shake so badly that he would drop his reading glasses on the floor of his own classroom. Have you ever been in a room where someone was dismissed, just completely erased, because of what they were wearing? Have you ever watched that happen and said nothing? Let me take you back. 7 hours earlier. Marcus Deal woke at 4:45 that morning, same as always. The alarm on his phone, a cracked screen Samsung his father had given him 2 Christmases ago, still going strong, played a soft piano tone that he'd downloaded from a free site. He lay in the dark of the room he rented for $640 a month in a 2-bedroom apartment on Carver Street, 3 miles from the Alderton campus, and he stared at the ceiling the way a man does when he's running something through his head. An equation, a sequence, a proof that had been sitting in the back of his mind for 11 days like a splinter he couldn't quite reach. He got up. He made coffee, the store-brand kind, scooped 3 times, no filter waste, and he sat at the kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn and opened the composition notebook. It was a black and white marble notebook, the same kind you could buy at any dollar store. And it was the 3rd one he'd filled this year. The cover had a small coffee stain in the bottom right corner from a morning in February when he'd been too excited about a partial solution to watch where he was setting his cup. He didn't mind the stain. His father had told him once that a working notebook was supposed to look worked in. The apartment on Carver Street was the kind of place that asked nothing of you except that you pay $640 on the 1st of the month and keep the noise down after 10. Marcus had a bedroom, a kitchen table, and a bathroom with a leaky cold water handle he'd fixed himself with a $3 washer from the hardware store on Bleecker. His roommate was a man named Troy who drove a delivery truck and was almost never home. The walls were thin. On still mornings you could hear the family upstairs starting their day, the particular rhythm of their footsteps, the smell of food cooking in oil through the vent above the stove, and Marcus had learned to find it comforting rather than intrusive. It reminded him of the house he'd grown up in, which had been smaller than this, and louder and had always smelled of something cooking. He drank his coffee standing at the kitchen window watching the city come on in increments. A bus at the far end of the street, a light going on in the bodega 2 buildings down, the sky above the roof lines moving from black to the particular charcoal gray that preceded dawn by about 20 minutes. He didn't need to look at his phone to know what time it was. His body had been calibrated to this schedule for 14 months. He showered, packed the composition notebook into the canvas bag he carried to work, and walked 8 blocks to the bus stop. The bus to Alderton ran every 40 minutes at that hour. Marcus always caught the 5:35. It took 22 minutes, and he spent them the way he spent most transit time, reading. Not always mathematics, sometimes history, sometimes a novel, though novels were harder to sustain because part of his mind was always elsewhere, running through a sequence or testing a boundary condition, the way a tongue finds a loose tooth. But this morning, he didn't open anything. He sat with the canvas bag on his lap and watched the city pass through the window, and thought about the end of the proof. His father, Henry Deal, had been a custodian at Alderton University for 22 years. Marcus had been working at the same university, same custodial staff, different shift assignment, for 14 months. He was 23 years old. He had a partial scholarship offer from a state school that had lapsed when his father's health failed 2 years ago. He had a GED, 2 semesters of community college credits, and a mind that, according to the one professor who had ever looked at his work properly, operated at a level that most doctoral programs didn't see in a decade. That professor was dead. That's a story we'll get to. The custodial staff at Alderton clocked in through a basement entrance on the east side of Kessler Hall. There were 11 people on Marcus's shift, and most of them had been there longer than he had. The supervisor was a woman named Dolores, who had worked at Alderton for 9 years and kept a photograph of her granddaughter taped to the inside of her locker and who had, on Marcus's third day, quietly told him that if he ever had a problem with anyone on the academic staff, and I mean anyone, he should come to her first. She had said it the way someone says something because they have seen the situation before and want to give someone a fighting chance. Marcus had thanked her and had not, until today, needed to take her up on it. He changed into his uniform, gray shirt, gray pants, the name tag that said Marcus in block letters, and collected his cart. The morning assignment on Thursdays was Kessler Hall, second and third floors. The hallway outside room 114 was first. For now, Marcus Deal, 4:47 in the morning, composition notebook open, pencil moving. The problem was a bounded resonance conjecture in applied topology, the kind of thing that shows up in quantum information theory and drives graduate students to take semesters off. A version of it had been sitting on the chalkboard in room 114 of Alderton's Kessler Hall for 3 weeks. Professor Whitfield had put it there himself, in front of his Thursday seminar, as what he called an open invitation to his students. The first one who cracks this, he had said, doesn't have to present their thesis chapter in March. Nobody had cracked it. His 34 graduate students, most of them from schools you'd recognize by name, all of them with 4-year degrees and recommendation letters and proper shoes, had been circling it for 21 days. Marcus had been watching it through the door. He'd been assigned to clean the hallway outside room 1014 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He'd noticed the equation the first week. He'd looked at it for maybe 40 seconds before the framework clicked into place in his head, the way certain things just clicked for Marcus, the way they had always clicked, going back to when he was 9 years old and his father had brought home a discarded calculus textbook from the university's recycling bin. And Marcus had finished it in 3 weeks. He hadn't said anything about the equation. He'd mopped the hall and gone to the next classroom and gone home and opened his notebook. That was 3 Thursdays ago. Today was Thursday again. What you need to understand about Marcus Deal is this. He was not trying to prove anything. He was not, as Professor Whitfield would later claim to the department chair, trying to embarrass anyone or disrupt an academic environment. He had solved the problem because the problem was there, the way you might fix a dripping faucet because the sound won't let you sleep. He'd written the full solution in his notebook the previous weekend and then spent 5 days checking it 3 different ways because that's what his father had taught him. Check it, then check it again, then sleep on it, and check it a 3rd time. He'd checked it a 3rd time the night before. But here is what made Thursday the 7th different from every other Thursday in that hallway. Marcus arrived to clean at 7:50 in the morning. Room 114 was empty. The seminar didn't start until 9. He propped the door with his bucket, began sweeping the back, and found himself standing at the board before he had fully decided to stand there. The chalk was in the tray, the equation sat there incomplete, the last line still pointing nowhere, the way it had for 3 weeks. He picked up the chalk. He told himself he would just write the next step, just one line to see how it looked in chalk rather than pencil. He wrote one line, then the next. One followed naturally, and the one after that. He wasn't showing off. He was finishing a thought that had been bothering him the way an unresolved chord bothers a musician. He was 7 lines deep into the solution when the door opened and the graduate students started filing in, looking at their phones, carrying their coffees, and then stopping. One by one they stopped and looked at the board. Nobody said anything. Not to Marcus, who by this point was aware of them and was moving toward the end of the proof with the focused calm of a man who has already lived through this moment several times in his imagination. Not to each other, though a few of them exchanged glances. They just stood there and watched, which was exactly the kind of witness the universe had arranged for what came next. Professor Harlan Whitfield walked in at 9:02. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, bow-tied, the kind of man who still wrote checks and expected people to wait while he did. He had a leather satchel, a Mont Blanc pen, and a deep and abiding belief that the hierarchy of intellectual life was fixed and natural and that he occupied its proper upper tier. He had been at Alderton for 19 years. He had a named chair that his wife's family had partially funded. He had written 4 textbooks, and one of them was assigned in 37 universities, which he mentioned in most conversations that ran longer than 10 minutes. He walked in, set his satchel on the desk, and looked up at the board. He saw Marcus. He saw the chalk in Marcus's hand. He saw the uniform. He did not yet see what was on the board. That would come later. Right now all he saw was the custodian touching his chalkboard, and something moved across his face. Not surprise, really. More like a decision being made. "Get that chalk out of your hand," he said. "Put it down, now." And Marcus turned around, and Marcus looked at him, and Marcus said, "I was just finishing." And Harlan Whitfield said, in front of 34 graduate students and the open door of room 114, "I don't think that's what you're here for, is it?" It was not a question. He crossed the floor toward the board, And what he did next, this is the thing that 34 people would remember and describe later, in statements, in posts, in a university investigation. What he did next was take the eraser from the tray. He looked at Marcus Deal the way a man looks when he wants to make sure you understand what's being communicated, and then he erased the board. Not strategically, not carefully, not preserving the original equation while removing the interloper's work. He erased everything, from the top left corner to the bottom right, long dragging strokes, the chalk dust rising in a small cloud that settled on Whitfield's sleeve and on Marcus's gray uniform, and on the floor between them. 3 weeks of work, gone. 21 days of his graduate student's effort, gone. And Marcus Deal's solution, the one he'd checked 3 times, the one that had lived in his notebook for 5 days, reduced to a smear of gray dust on a green board. The composition notebook was sitting on the floor near the mop bucket where Marcus had set it when he picked up the chalk. Whitfield looked at it. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing when he wants to communicate that it doesn't belong. He picked it up. "I'll have facilities collect your things," he said. "You'll wait outside." And he tossed the notebook, this is the word every witness later used, tossed, toward the trash can near the door. It didn't go in. It hit the rim and fell to the floor, splayed open, the pencil falling out and rolling under a desk. Marcus Deal looked at the notebook on the floor, then he looked at Professor Whitfield. "I need that back," he said. His voice was level, quiet, the quietness of a man who has practiced stillness so long it has become a form of armor. "You need to leave," Whitfield said. "Before I call security and make this a different kind of conversation," Marcus bent down and picked up the notebook. He picked up the pencil from under the desk. He looked at the board, blank now, perfectly blank. And then he looked briefly at the 34 graduate students, none of whom had moved or spoken. He walked to the door. But here is what nobody noticed, or rather what nobody noticed until later, when someone went back and looked. A young woman in the 3rd row, a second-year doctoral student named Priya Subramaniam, had her laptop open. She had been running a recording application since before Whitfield walked in. She had started it because she'd thought something might happen. She was right. That recording was 9 minutes and 43 seconds long, and in 4 hours, it would be somewhere it could not be taken back from. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. What you need to understand before the reckoning is the debt that was owed. Because this story is not really about an equation on a board. It is about a 22-year promise and a dead man's hands and a truth that had been waiting in a notebook for the right moment to walk into the light. So let me tell you about Henry Deal. Henry Deal arrived at Alderton University in the fall of 2002 with a mop, a set of work boots, and a mind that his own father had once described with a mixture of pride and grief, as a gift wrapped in the wrong box. Henry had grown up in a town 200 miles south of Alderton, the third of 6 children, in a house where books were borrowed from the library because you couldn't afford to own them. He had been extraordinary at mathematics from the time he could hold a pencil. His high school teacher, a woman named Mrs. Elaine Garrett, who drove 20 minutes each way on her own time to bring him practice problems from a community college, had told him once, quietly, after class, that she had never taught anyone like him, that she wasn't sure she ever would again. Henry had won a full scholarship to a small technical university. He'd arrived the fall of 1988. He had lasted 6 months. The details of what happened are not dramatic in the way stories want them to be. There was no single villain, no single moment. There was a department chair who could not quite bring himself to sponsor a black student's research proposal. There was a professor, a man named Dr. Victor Pralley, who wore corduroy and quoted Wittgenstein and had a reputation for identifying promising young talent, who had given Henry a grade of C on a proof that later, years later, after Henry was long gone, appeared in a journal under a different student's name. The proof concerned a specific class of bounded sequence convergence in functional analysis. It was not a famous problem. It was not the kind of work that makes the front page of anything, but it was Henry Deal's work. His original work, his handwriting, had been in the margins of the draft that Prale had asked to review, and when it appeared in print with someone else's name on it, Henry was already gone, working construction, then a restaurant, then a hospital laundry, and had no institutional standing to contest anything. Prale would go on to receive a departmental teaching award the same year the paper was published. He retired with a reception and a plaque in 2011. There was also a financial aid error that was almost certainly not an error, and a formal complaint process that moved very slowly, and an advisor who told Henry, with a sadness that may or may not have been sincere, that perhaps this environment was not quite the right fit. Henry left. He got a job. He got married. He had a son named Marcus. Dr. Augustin Ferreira had been a junior faculty member at that institution when Henry was there. He had not been Henry's advisor, had not been in a position to intervene in the specific mechanics of what happened, but he had seen enough to know what it was. He had carried that knowledge for the better part of 3 decades. When he came across the published proof, years later, and recognized in its structure the same conceptual fingerprints he had seen in Henry's coursework, he had spoken to the department chair, he had spoken to the journal's editorial board, he had written a letter to the university's academic integrity office that was 3 pages long and cited 4 specific instances of correspondence. Nothing happened. The letter was acknowledged. A review was initiated. The review concluded that the evidence was insufficient to support a finding of misconduct. Prale had denied everything. The other student, who was by then a junior professor at a different school, had denied everything. 14 years passed. Ferreira had never fully let it go. He had kept the correspondence in a file folder in the bottom drawer of his desk, and he had moved that file folder with him through 2 universities and 3 office changes. And when he finally sat across from Marcus Deal and opened those 2 pages of notebook, the thing he had felt was not surprise. It was recognition. It was the feeling of a debt finally, at long last, approaching repayment. And he brought home the books. That is the part of this story that matters most. Every book he found in a recycling bin, every discarded journal, every textbook with a cracked spine, he brought them home. He read them himself sometimes in the evenings after Marcus was asleep, the way a man might visit a country he was not allowed to live in. But mostly he brought them home for Marcus. They would sit together at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings. This is the image Marcus returns to more than almost any other image from his childhood. Henry with his reading glasses on, Marcus with his pencil, working through problems from a textbook that had been discarded because a newer edition had come out. The kitchen smelled of whatever they'd had for dinner. The radiator knocked. Henry would watch Marcus work, not correcting unless Marcus asked, because he understood that the working was the thing. The struggle was the thing. The moment of arrival had to belong entirely to Marcus, or it meant nothing. "You're going to finish what I started," he told Marcus once, when Marcus was 12 and had just solved a problem Henry had set for him from a graduate-level analysis textbook. A problem Henry had once been told, by a professor who later plagiarized his work, was too advanced for undergraduates. Henry said it without drama, the way a man states a fact. "You're going to finish it for both of us." Marcus did not say yes. He didn't need to. Some things do not require words, now. The notebook, the black and white marble composition notebook that Whitfield had tossed toward a trash can, that notebook had on its inside front cover written in Henry Deal's handwriting in blue ballpoint pen, a single line. It was the kind of inscription a father writes in a book he's giving his son for a reason that goes deeper than he wants to explain out loud. For Marcus, keep going. It was the last thing Henry Deal had written before his stroke 14 months ago. Henry was alive. He was in a rehabilitation facility on the west side of the city, partially paralyzed, partially recovered, working every day with a physical therapist who had told Marcus 3 months ago that she had rarely seen anyone fight as hard as Henry Deal. But his hands, the hands that had once worked through proofs in the margins of discarded textbooks, his hands shook now. He could not write more than a few words at a time. Those 3 words in the notebook were the last clear sentence he had managed. Keep going. Marcus had kept going. He'd walked out of room 114 with the notebook under his arm, and he had gone back to his mop bucket, and he had finished cleaning the hallway, and then he had clocked out for his break and sat in the custodial staff lounge on the basement level, with a cup of coffee and the notebook open to the solution he'd spent 11 days building. He read it through once, he read it through a second time. Then, he took out his phone and sent a text message to a number he had been given 8 months ago by a man named Dr. Augustine Ferreira. Remember that name. Marcus's text was 4 words. "I need to show you something." Dr. Augustine Ferreira was 68 years old. He was a retired professor of mathematics, a former department chair at a university considerably more prestigious than Alderton, and the person who had, 14 years earlier, been Henry Deal's one consistent advocate, the professor who had looked at Henry's work after the fact, after Henry had already left, after the plagiarized proof had already been published under someone else's name, and had spent 3 years trying unsuccessfully to get the record corrected. Ferreira had failed to correct the record. He had never forgiven himself for it. He had met Marcus 8 months ago through a mutual acquaintance in the university's facilities department, a small miracle of circumstances that both of them recognized as something more than coincidence. He had asked to see Marcus's work. Marcus had shown him 2 pages from the first composition notebook. Ferreira had read those 2 pages, and then sat quietly for a long moment, and then asked if he could see the rest. "This is Henry's son," he had said to himself, very quietly in a voice Marcus wasn't sure he was supposed to hear. In the 8 months since that meeting, Dr. Ferreira had done 3 things. First, he had verified Marcus's work, all of it, every notebook, with a methodical care that Marcus recognized as the same care Henry had always insisted on. Check it, then check it again, then sleep on it. Second, he had made 17 phone calls and written 9 letters to people whose names opened doors that Marcus had never been able to see from the outside. And third, this was the thing that was supposed to happen in 2 more weeks, but which was now, because of a tossed composition notebook and a man named Whitfield, going to happen today. He had arranged a formal presentation. The presentation had been scheduled for a university colloquium 3 weeks from now, but when Marcus's text came through at 10:17 that morning, Ferreira read it and then read it again, and then made 2 phone calls. The first was to the Dean of Academic Affairs at Alderton. The second was to a colleague who was already on campus. He was in his car 11 minutes after receiving the text. Remember, 11 minutes. Because what happened next moved faster than Professor Harlan Whitfield, who was at that moment in room 114, back to his usual Thursday seminar, having put the morning's unpleasantness behind him with the practiced efficiency of a man who had always found such things easy to put behind him. What happened next moved faster than he was remotely prepared for. The seminar resumed. The board was blank. One of Whitfield's graduate students had mentioned, quietly to a friend, that they had seen the work before it was erased. That friend had told 2 others, and Priya Subramaniam, in the 3rd row, had closed her laptop and walked to the restroom and uploaded the video to her private drive, and then, after 40 seconds of sitting on the edge of a bathroom sink, thinking about what she was about to do, posted it to 3 places at once. By noon, it had 14,000 views. By 2 o'clock, it had passed 60,000. The caption she had written was simple. It was 7 words. "This is what happened in my class today." By 1:15, the Dean of Academic Affairs had watched it. By 1:40, the university's communications director had watched it. By 2:08, a journalist at a national science publication who covered equity in academic institutions had watched it and had sent 3 emails and had opened a new document on her laptop. But none of this had found Harlan Whitfield yet. He was in his office on the 3rd floor of Kessler Hall, eating a sandwich from the faculty dining room and reading a journal article, entirely unaware that the world outside his office had been rearranging itself around a 9-minute video for the past 4 hours. It found him at 2:37. That was when his office phone rang. It was his department chair. The conversation was brief and its contents were relayed afterward by the chair to the dean's office and can be summarized as follows. Whitfield had argued initially that he had been enforcing standard policies regarding non-academic personnel in academic spaces. He had said that the young man had been disruptive. He had said that the work on the board had been, in his professional estimation, likely incorrect or incomplete, and that its presence was potentially confusing to his students. The department chair had told him to come to a meeting in the dean's office at 4 o'clock. Whitfield had said he would be there. He was thinking at this point about the $400,000 endowed chair that his wife's family had helped fund. He was thinking about tenure. He was thinking about his 4 textbooks. He was thinking in the particular way that men who have never truly been held to account tend to think when the accounting approaches, that there would be some explaining to do, some awkwardness, and then things would return to normal. He was not thinking about Marcus Deal. He was not thinking about what the board had said before he erased it. He was not thinking about a retired professor named Ferreira who was, at that moment, walking into Kessler Hall with a copy of Marcus's solution printed on 4 sheets of paper and a briefcase containing 8 months of corroborating verification. The dean's office was on the 2nd floor. At 3:58, 2 minutes before the scheduled meeting, Harlan Whitfield arrived and found the hallway outside the dean's suite more populated than he had expected. The department chair was there. The associate provost was there, a woman he did not recognize who would later introduce herself as the university's general counsel was there. And there, standing near the window at the far end of the hallway with a cup of coffee and a leather briefcase, was Dr. Augustin Ferreira. Whitfield knew Ferreira. Everyone in the field knew Ferreira. You did not spend 30 years at the intersection of pure and applied mathematics without knowing the work of Augustin Ferreira. Whitfield had cited Ferreira's work twice in his textbooks. Whitfield stopped walking. Ferreira looked at him across the hallway with an expression that was entirely calm, the way a man looks when he has been preparing for a moment for 14 years. "Harlan," he said. "Just the name, nothing else." They went into the conference room. But we need to pause here for one moment because something else was happening simultaneously, something that had nothing to do with conference rooms or legal counsel or university administrators, and everything to do with the reason any of this matters. At 3:45, Marcus Deal had gone back to Kessler Hall. He had not been asked to come back. He had come back because Dr. Ferreira had called him and told him, quietly, that he deserved to be present for what was about to happen. Marcus had stood outside the building for a long minute, looking up at the stone letters above the main entrance. Letters that had been carved there in 1937, the names of donors, the names of founding faculty, not a single name that looked like his. Then he had gone inside. He was standing in the hallway outside the dean's conference room when the meeting started. The door was thick. He could not hear what was being said. He sat on a bench along the wall with the composition notebook in his hands, open to the inside front cover, his father's handwriting in blue ink. Keep going. In the conference room, Dr. Ferreira had laid out 4 pages on the conference table. He had talked for 22 minutes without being interrupted once. What he had said, and this is the condensed version, the version the university's internal report would later summarize in 2 careful paragraphs. What he said was this: the equation that had been on the board in room 114 for 3 weeks was a version of a resonance bounding problem that Ferreira himself had worked on in the early 1990s and had never been able to fully resolve. The solution that Marcus Deal had written on that board was not a partial solution, it was a complete, rigorous, correct proof. Ferreira had verified it independently in full over a period of 8 months, using 3 different methodological approaches. It was, in his professional judgment, and he wanted to be precise about this, work of publishable quality, graduate-level publishable quality, in a serious journal. The person who had produced this work was a 23-year-old man with no formal university degree who had taught himself from discarded textbooks in a 1-bedroom apartment on Carver Street. The person who had erased that work and thrown his notebook toward a trash can was a tenured full professor at this institution. Ferreira then said one more thing. He said that Marcus's father, Henry Deal, had worked in the custodial department of this university for 22 years. He said that Henry Deal had himself been a mathematician of exceptional ability, whose academic career had been ended at another institution under circumstances that were, to put it very plainly, discriminatory. He said that he, Ferreira, had known this for 14 years and had not done enough. He said he was here to correct that now as much as it could be corrected. He said he had already spoken that morning with the editor of a journal. He said that pending the university's cooperation in properly crediting Marcus's work, the paper they planned to submit together would acknowledge Alderton University, but that this was contingent. The dean looked at the 4 pages on the table, she looked at the general counsel, she looked at the department chair. Then she asked someone to bring Marcus in. He came through the door with his notebook. He sat across the table from Harlan Whitfield, who had not spoken in 40 minutes. Ferreira slid the 4 printed pages across to Marcus. He said, "Walk us through it." And Marcus Deal, in a gray custodial uniform with his father's handwriting in the notebook on the table in front of him, walked through his solution, line by line, from the initial topological setup, through the bounded resonance reduction, through the final convergence argument. He answered 2 technical questions from the associate provost, who had a background in applied mathematics. He answered one from Ferreira, who asked it not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted the room to hear Marcus answer it. Harlan Whitfield sat at the end of the table. His hands were folded, and then, at some point during Marcus's explanation, this was the moment that 2 of the people present described afterward in nearly identical language, unprompted. At some point Whitfield looked down at the 4 pages. He picked up one of them. He read. His hands were not steady. He set the page back down. The dean spoke. She said there would be a formal review of the incident. She said the recording that had at that point passed 112,000 views, would be part of the record. She said that Professor Whitfield should contact Human Resources in the morning. She turned to Marcus. She said that the university would like to discuss formally and without delay a pathway to enrollment and funding. She said she was sorry that he had been treated the way he had been treated. She said this in front of everyone in the room, including Harlan Whitfield. Marcus nodded. He said it the way his father had taught him to accept things, with grace and without any rush to forgive. Now, here is what happened next. And it happened fast. Priya Subramaniam's video did not stop at 112,000 views. By 9 that evening it had passed 400,000. By the following morning of Friday, it was the top trending topic in every academic social media space the university monitored, and had been shared by 7 verified accounts with audiences over 1 million. The caption that had been attached to it when it was reshared by a journalist, "A janitor's son just solved the problem that stumped a PhD seminar and got thrown out for it." Those words became the defining frame that no communications department could undo. The hashtag appeared by Thursday evening. Keep going Marcus. It was his father's inscription leaked from Priya's follow-up post, in which she had photographed the inside cover of the notebook with Marcus's permission. By Friday morning it had 80,000 posts. The university's formal investigation opened Monday. It was not slow. The investigation was formally called a review of faculty conduct and departmental practice. and it was overseen by a 3-person panel that included an outside academic from a peer institution. Whitfield was notified by registered mail. He was also notified by the 14 messages waiting in his university email inbox when he returned from a weekend at his wife's family's lake house, a weekend during which he had, in his wife's later account to her sister, been largely unable to sleep. He had understood, by Sunday, that the situation was not going to normalize. The video had nearly 2 million views by the time he checked his phone on Sunday morning. 2 weeks after the incident, the following were true. Professor Harlan Whitfield had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome. His teaching duties for the spring semester were suspended. 3 of his former students, emboldened by the attention the case had received, had submitted formal complaints about grading practices and conduct going back 7 years. One of them was a woman who had been in Whitfield's seminar 4 years earlier and had received a C- on a thesis chapter that was later, under a different advisor, published in a peer-reviewed journal. She had never connected the 2 events publicly, until now. The week after she filed her complaint, 2 more students submitted similar accounts. The department's records were being reviewed by the Academic Integrity Office. The named professorship, the one partially funded by his wife's family, had been placed in an administrative hold while the legal department reviewed its terms and whether the conditions of the gift had been met. The institution Whitfield had insulted, it turned out, was not simply Marcus Steele. It was a pattern. The university's general counsel had initiated a legal analysis of historical discriminatory practices in the mathematics department going back 30 years. This was not a coincidence. It was a consequence. The analysis was triggered partly by Dr. Ferreira's documentation of what had happened to Henry Deal at the other institution, and partly by a university archivist who, prompted by the media attention, had located 4 formal complaints filed by Black and Latino students in the mathematics department between 1995 and 2008. Complaints that had been logged, reviewed, and filed. None had resulted in any formal finding or corrective action. They were being reviewed now. The outside journalist, the one from the science publication who had opened a new document on her laptop that Thursday, had published her piece the following Tuesday. It was not a short piece. It was 4,000 words, carefully sourced, and it named Whitfield by name, described Henry Deal's history in detail, quoted Dr. Ferreira at length, and included a sidebar on the broader pattern of credential gatekeeping in academic mathematics. It was the 3rd most read article on the publication's website that month. 2 other national outlets ran follow-up pieces within the week. A morning news program segment aired on Friday. The dean's phone did not stop ringing. A formal letter of apology, signed by the university president, had been hand-delivered to Henry Deal's rehabilitation facility on a Tuesday morning. Henry's physical therapist said he read it 3 times. She said his hands were shaking and that she thought at first that it was the Parkinson's adjacent symptoms, but then she saw his face. She said he was crying. She said it was the first time she had seen him cry in 11 months of working with him. A second letter, addressed to Henry directly from the department chair, acknowledged in language that had clearly been reviewed by legal counsel but was nonetheless real, that the practices that had ended his academic career warranted examination, and that the university was committed to being a different institution than the one that had failed him. It said this inadequately, the way institutions almost always say these things. But it said it. Henry folded it and put it in the drawer beside his bed. Marcus Steele was enrolled at Alderton University on a full academic scholarship by the end of the month. This was not charity. This was the university acknowledging what had been sitting in plain sight for 14 months in a gray uniform mopping their hallways. The paper, the one presenting Marcus's proof co-authored with Dr. Augustine Ferreira as a supervising collaborator, was accepted for review at one of the 3 journals to which it was submitted. It was, in the journal's editorial language, accepted with minor revisions. The acknowledgement section thanked Henry Deal by name. And here is the part that matters most. Here is the part that is not about institutions and investigations and legal reviews and hashtags, even though all of those things matter and all of them were necessary. One Saturday morning, 11 weeks after the day in room 114, Marcus drove to the rehabilitation facility on the west side of the city. He had a copy of the journal's acceptance letter in his jacket pocket, folded in thirds. He had the composition notebook under his arm. His father was sitting in the common room by the window, the way he did on Saturday mornings when the light came in at the right angle. He was thinner than he used to be. His left hand rested on the arm of the wheelchair with the particular stillness that came from effort rather than ease. But his eyes were clear, and when he saw Marcus come through the door, his face did something that Marcus had carried in his memory since he was 9 years old and had first solved something his father had thought might stump him. Marcus sat down. He opened the notebook to the page with the proof. He placed the acceptance letter on top of it. Henry Deal looked at the letter for a long time. "You checked it?" he said. 3 times, Marcus said. Henry's right hand moved. Slowly, with effort, he reached out and put it on top of Marcus's hand. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have liked this." And Marcus said, "I know. I wrote it for all 3 of us. There is one more piece." The Deal Mathematics Initiative at Alderton University was announced 4 months after the incident. Funded partly by a coalition of alumni who had followed the story, partly by a significant contribution from Dr. Augustin Ferreira, and partly, this part matters, by a portion of the settlement that the university reached in the Historical Discrimination Review, the initiative would fund 5 annual scholarships for students from underrepresented backgrounds who demonstrated exceptional mathematical ability but lacked formal academic credentials. It would be housed in the same building as the mathematics department. The room where it was announced, the room where new scholarship recipients would gather each year for their first meeting, was room 114 Kessler Hall. There is a small plaque on the wall inside the door. It says, "For Henry Deal, who kept going." Below that, in smaller letters, "And for Marcus, who finished what he started." Go back to the moment Marcus turned around at that chalkboard. When Whitfield said, "Put it down." Watch Marcus's face. He doesn't argue. He doesn't raise his voice. He just looks at the man with all the composure of someone who has been carrying 23 years of accumulated proof that the world underestimates people who look like him and work the jobs he works, and he looks at him with a stillness that in retrospect was not submission. It was never submission. It was certainty. He already knew what he had written. He already knew what it meant. He was simply waiting for the moment when everyone else would know it too. If this story moved you, and I believe it did, please like it, share it, and subscribe. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. And I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where someone's worth was erased because of how they looked or where they came from? What did you do? Tell me in the comments. Here's what really gets me about this story. It's not the equation. It's not even the moment Whitfield's hands shook, though I will be honest with you, that image doesn't leave you easily. What gets me is the notebook, the black and white marble composition notebook with the coffee stain on the cover. The one Henry Deal had given his son. The one with 3 words in blue ballpoint pen on the inside front cover, written by a man whose hands shook but who had steadied them long enough to write those 3 words because he knew they needed to be there. Keep going. Henry Deal was a mathematician. He was a brilliant, gifted, patient mathematician who was pushed out of an institution that could not see past what he looked like, and who spent 22 years mopping the hallways of a building where his work could have been, should have been, on the walls. He brought the books home. He built the library. He taught his son not just the mathematics, but the faith that the mathematics was worth doing, that it was worth doing even when no one was watching, even when no one gave you credit, even when someone stood in front of you and erased it. And his son walked into that room and finished the proof. I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it. What is your $640 a month cracked screen phone composition notebook moment? What is the thing you have been working on, quietly, without anyone seeing, without anyone crediting you, that is waiting for its moment to walk into the light? Because if Henry Deal's story teaches us anything, if Marcus Deal's story teaches us anything, it is this: the proof doesn't disappear when someone erases the board. It lives in the notebook. It lives in the work. It lives in the person who did it. The board can be erased. The work cannot. Leave me a comment. Tell me about your notebook.